Today we're going to take a look at classical Persia, and this is going to be a real brief introduction to the Persian Empire because in our course of study it's more important to understand the interaction between the Persians and the Greeks, whom we'll study about soon. But as you can see on the map here, this is the Middle East. Here you see modern-day Turkey, here is Greece, here is Egypt, modern-day Saudi Arabia, and you see the Middle Eastern countries, or what would be our modern-day Middle Eastern countries here. The Persian Empire was the biggest of its time. It dwarfed all the other empires as far as landmass goes for its time. And if you remember from Unit 1, this is the successor to the Mesopotamian empires that had come and gone throughout the ancient period. And the Mesopotamian empires, depending on which one you're talking about, never got too big. And that, part of that was because they kept getting conquered by other peoples, and so there was never any sustainability. But we're going to see that change with the Persian Empire, as they're going to be able to sustain a fairly lengthy large empire. But all good things must come to an end, and we'll talk about its collapse as well. So the dates that we're looking at here, I use these dates a little loosely. You have 550 BCE to 600 CE. However, the Persian Empire, as I just showed you on the map, only exists for about 250, 300 years. Other empires come and take its place, and while they're referenced as the Persians later on, so to speak, they don't have the same clout and influence and land conquered that the early Persian Empire did. So the Assyrians were like the last of the Mesopotamian empires to have any real power, and one group called the Medes end up coming in, challenging them after they had settled, and the Assyrian Empire, which was already on the decline, ends up collapsing and leaves a void in the Middle East. And so around 550, the Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, begin to put together their empire. And they do it rather quickly. So it becomes known as the Achaemenid Empire, and its base, its center, is modern-day Iran. Now, Cyrus was a great military man, and he ends up conquering all the way to Greece in the west, all the way to India in the east, from the Caucasus Mountains in the north, all the way to North Africa and Egypt. So, like I showed you on the map, a pretty large empire. So Cyrus does most of the conquering, but it's Darius, his son, who, or Darius as some people pronounce it, who ends up being the greatest king that the Persians had. And he was known not so much as a conqueror, but as an administrator. Darius ends up figuring out a good way. You got this massive empire. How are you going to run it effectively without the people revolting? And so he divides the empire up into 20 provinces, fairly equal in size. A satrap, who is like a governor, would oversee each province. So you had a mini president or king or ruler over each province who then reported back to the King of Kings, Darius. So they collected taxes and sent the money back to the king, and the king just oversaw everything from a distance. So the Persian Empire, well, what's good about it? Well, they built roads. As a matter of fact, they built something called the Royal Road, which stretched for about 1,700 miles, a rather remarkable achievement in the classical world. And so you're able to have information travel fairly safely. Trade is able to move fairly safely within the empire, albeit slowly. And Darius comes up with the way he wants to run his empire is let people do as they please. Allow them to keep their customs. Allow them to worship what they want. They didn't force their religion on them. Allow them pretty much every freedom they had before, with the exception that they pay the tribute or the tax to the Persian king. And as long as you lived by, you didn't rebel, as long as you paid your tribute or tax, they pretty much let you govern yourself to a large degree. So this was a big deal. And those who were furthest away from the capital of Persepolis, they actually enjoyed greater autonomy and freedom than people who were closer to the capital. What brings about the Persian collapse? Well, a lot of factors. Xerxes, from those of you who have seen the movie 300, a fairly fictionalized version of events, but nonetheless Xerxes is portrayed in that movie as a god king, and Xerxes comes along and he decides to change the way things are, the way Darius had done them. And he's not going to allow cultural toleration. He's going to impose his will upon the peoples. And you can imagine, if you had been a subject of the Persian Empire when they had allowed all this freedom, you're not going to just sit there and accept this new way of doing things. And so rebellion was rampant all across the empire, especially in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Ionian Greeks, people who were from Greece who had settled in modern-day Turkey. They were rebelling at different times over the course of a century and a half. And so all these rebellions, no single rebellion brings down the Persian Empire, but what they do is they weaken it. The subjects of the Persian Empire were less likely to be loyal to the king, less likely to fight for the empire when called upon. And so in 334, Alexander the Great, whom we've already mentioned and we'll learn about in more detail soon, invades Persia and conquers it rather quickly. And Alexander takes the empire for himself. Unfortunately for him, he dies young, and eventually his generals divide up his conquered lands, including Egypt and the rest of the Persian Empire, into smaller empires. So as far as the Persian Empire, the way we just described it existing, it's not that long. You can see 334, that's only a few hundred years like that. And so the Middle East becomes a series of smaller empires that aren't nearly as powerful or as important. And they remain that way until around the 7th century CE, when the Islamic Empire of the religion impacting people's lives too much, but the impact that it had on later religions that are still around today. Zoroastrianism has pretty much died out over time, but it was one of the first monotheistic religions. And because of that, because of some of its teachings, we see Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all influenced by its structure compared to the polytheistic religions we see of the ancient world. There's the idea of just one God. There's a notion of heaven and hell, which none of the polytheistic religions had. The notion that you are rewarded for good behavior and punished for bad behavior. Or a Mazda was the Messiah who would come again and save everything. But unlike maybe Islam or Christianity, there's actually a notion of you should enjoy everything the world has to offer, including sex, including interacting with other people, good works, good thoughts, and good deeds. That was kind of the catchphrase of this empire, or of this religion. But finally, it begins to fall as a prominent religion in this region, with Islam coming in the 7th century. The Islamic conquerors, when they come, they don't say you can no longer be Zoroastrian. They were actually tolerant of other religions, religious faiths, but they did put political and financial pressure on the priests, the magi, and so it hurt the temples. So if you wanted to be Zoroastrian, you had to pay a special tax, for example, and so it wasn't economically viable to stay that religion within the Islamic empires. So some people fled to continue worshiping, but most ended up converting to Islam. So the one other thing worth noting, and I believe John Green brings this up in the crash course video you'll watch, but Zoroastrianism prohibited slavery. And so slavery was not very prominent in the Persian Empire. Now you're going to later on hear the Greeks, when they fight against the Persians, saying we don't want to become slaves, but that word is not really being used correctly. They would be subjects of the Persian Empire, and if they had just given up like the Persians had requested, as opposed to fighting them, the Greeks would have been allowed all the same privileges of self-rule that the Persians had allowed all of their other subjects. But that's for another day, and we'll be following up with learning about the Greeks real soon, because their interactions with the Persians is essential to understand.